Well, the world's not the same as it used to be. And it seems like every generation, well, they're concerned about the changes in the world. And we begin to realize that the climate's changing. Crime, well, it's increasing daily. Political tension, well, that's always changing. There's always politics. And of course, we have the natural disasters, and they seem to be increasing and even getting worse. But is it really true? Is the world really on the verge of some big, big change? And the real question is Jesus Christ coming back in your lifetime? That's the real question. Can he come back in your lifetime? You know, there's a story in the Bible where Jesus is walking past the temple with his disciples. And as they look at this magnificent building, it's this big temple, their hearts kind of swells with a little bit of pride. They're looking at Jesus and they say, well, this is proof positive that God is with us. And what's he say? Well, he sets the stage for, well, our understanding of world history, our understanding of prophecy. See, in Matthew 24, he says, do you not see all these things? Assuredly, I say unto you that not one stone will be left on top of another. They shall all be thrown down. When we look at that story, we begin to understand that the disciples were a little bit troubled with this. But Jesus is laying the foundation for all Bible prophecy. And he was absolutely right. In 40 years later, in 70 AD, there's a group known as the Zealots, and they came and, well, there's a little bit of an uprising against the Roman occupation. And of course, well, the Romans, they responded in kind. And a Roman general by the name of Titus moved into the city. And as he come into the city, the Romans responded by throwing a fire into it. They took a torch and threw into the temple. And as they did that, well, the temple caught on fire and it burned so hot that it actually began to melt the gold that was inside the temple, and it ran down through the stones. From what we can tell, that Roman soldier that threw that in there, we can never identify him, but we do know what happened that day. The building was full of cedar, burned extremely hot, and the gold melted between every one of those stones, and not one stone was left upon another because those soldiers were looking for the gold that had ran down through there. So Jesus was absolutely right. The prophecy was extremely clear. Today in Rome, you see a memorial of the Arch. And that memorial, when we look at it, it's called the Arch of Titus. And then when you look inside the arch, you begin to see the Roman soldiers carrying away the seven candlestick. They carry that menorah out of there, and it's all there in the arch. The temple fell exactly the way Jesus predicted. It was very clear. Not one stone will be left upon another. And it wasn't. It was completely dismantled in the search for gold. So Jesus' prophecy was true. And it came to pass. That day it bothered the disciples. And the disciples, well, they were really disturbed about all this. If the temple falls, then, well, that must be the end of the world. That must be the time of the end. You know, in Matthew 24:3, Jesus begins to tell them, as he sat upon the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately saying, tell us, will these things be? And what will be the sign of your coming at the end of the age? See, Lord, if the temple falls, that means the end has to come, right? It must mean that you're about to set up your kingdom. They were really excited to have all this take place. But give us a sign. Now, I want you to listen to what Jesus says very closely. It bothered not only the disciples, but it's bothered Christians for over 2,000 years. In Matthew 24:4, he says, Jesus answered and said unto them, take heed that no one deceives you. Take heed that no one does what? Deceives you. Well, apparently it's easy to be deceived. And that's a very important word. It's a very important concept all through Bible prophecy. And if you're going to see it come up again and again as we study the Word of God. God says that before Jesus comes, there's going to be a lot of confusion in the world. There's going to be a lot of things that happen in the world. And he says, you're going to have to be very careful or you will be deceived. I want you to be sure that you know God and what God has to say. Let no one deceive you. Matthew 24:5, he says, for many will come in my name, saying, I am the Christ, and will deceive many. And you will hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that you're not troubled. For all these things must come to pass, but the end is not yet. For nation shall rise against nation, kingdom against kingdom, and there shall be famines and pestilences and earthquakes in various places. And they asked, Lord, when are you going to return? How will we know? What are the signs? You're going to know when it's close, Jesus says. But watch for these things. Watch and look for false Christ. Watch for an increase of wars. Watch for an increase in famine, in pestilences, in earthquakes. And then watch out, because it's almost time. You're within that season. There's no time to be a skeptic. But they always say, well, that's not true. We've always had those things. We've always had religion gone bad. Religion goes bad all the time. There's a lot of confusion in the world. There's a lot of people that will turn and twist the Bible around, and they can make a good dollar from it. But we've also had nations going to war. We always have one nation going to war with another nation, one kingdom against another kingdom. And we've always had earthquakes, right? And famine. We've always had pestilences. We've had all these things. And you know what? It's tempting to think like the skeptics, right? It just seems to happen again and again and again. But except for the fact that they haven't read the next verse. And if you're going to study Bible prophecy, you need to study it all. You need to read the whole thing. You need to understand. And the skeptics forget about verse 8. In Matthew 24, verse 8, all these things are the beginning of the sorrows. And that means we are in the beginning of the sorrows if we begin to study this out. That's a very important word. And I don't believe that Jesus used it by accident. I think he was very purposeful in saying that. So the question is, how many of you have had a baby? Well, how many of you ladies have had a baby? How many guys have you watched your lady have a baby? So let me ask you a question. Does the baby arrive with no warning? Not usually. You know, no warning means one minute you're walking along and boom, now you got a baby. No, it doesn't happen that. There's no way that it moves that fast. So when we look at it, when a baby is about to be born, the mother feels something called contractions. And she feels those at first, and sometimes they're kind of, well, they're not too close together, but there's contractions. And for the first child, well, you grab up the suitcase, you run to the hospital, and then you find out those contractions, well, not yet. Go back home. You go back home, you set the suitcase by the front door, you get everything ready. A couple days later, guess what? You got contractions again. Well, it goes again and again and again, until finally one day the contractions come. You grab up the wife, you go out to the car, you run to the hospital, and guess what? You forgot the suitcase. You know, we need to understand that this world is having contractions. They're becoming stronger and stronger as we go through time. So do you know what word Jesus used to describe the signs of his coming? He uses sorrows, right? The original in the Hebrew is adin. It's contractions, it's labor pains. And he's very clear on how he produces that and when he produces it so that we can have an understanding. Jesus knows that we've always had wars. Jesus knows that we've always had famine. Jesus knows that we've always had pestilences, and he knows that there's always going to be earthquakes in this sin-filled world. But he's telling us they are contractions. And at first they may be far and few between, but as we get closer and closer to the second coming, they're going to be stronger, they're going to be faster, and they're going to come, seems like one right after another. So let me ask you a question. If Jesus wants us to look for contractions, if he warned us to look for those contractions, how big are they right now? And that's our question. How close are we getting? Now I want you to be careful. We're not going to be setting a date. We're not going to do any of that. But we are going to try to understand how close we are to the coming of Jesus Christ. So we're not allowed to set the date, but we're going to figure out a season. Jesus says in Matthew 24:36 that no man knows the day or the hour. So now some people say, okay, well, we might not know the hour, but we can know the year, right? And Lord knows we've had plenty of people that have tried to, well, pin that year down. And they make a lot of money in trying to get that done too. In Acts 1:17, Jesus tells the disciples that we can't know the time or the seasons either. We're not allowed to know exactly when he is going to come. So of course the question is, why not? Why doesn't God want us to have the day when he's coming, the exact moment when he's coming? Well, we could be ready, right? Well, you know how people are. I think back to school, if you needed to get ready for an exam, you're going to wait until that specific day, and then you're going to study really hard just the night before. So if people know the exact time when Jesus is coming, well, they're going to live their lives any way they want, and just before he comes, they're going to straighten up so they'll be prepared for his coming. It's about a relationship. It's not just about being ready either. It's not a legal arrangement between you and God. It's that relationship that we need to understand. It's a relationship that we need to have with him. And you can't really build one of those in, 6 minutes just before he comes. It's going to take work of a lifetime. It's going to take a lot of time with God. And he wants you to be ready now, today, because today could be your day. So we can't pick dates, but we can get a sense of how close we are getting. In verse 32, Jesus compares the signs to a fig tree in springtime. And when the leaves come out, it's almost time for summer. It's almost there. So when the contractions are bigger and stronger, Jesus is, almost here. The biggest mistake somebody can do after seeing this topic is to think that they have time. To think that they have all the time in the world because we've always had these problems, and set your Bible down and not follow Christ, not search for the truth. Jesus made it very clear that these are the beginning of the sorrows. It may just be the beginning, but it is also the beginning of your walk with Christ. And to know that you are going through these sorrows, through these things in this world, you're building a relationship. Every trial that comes upon you, you build a relationship with God. You begin to build that relationship with Christ and rely on him, and your faith grows daily. So not only is it a time knowing that Jesus will come in the end, but your faith will be built day by day. It's called the gospel because it's the good news, and there's a lot of bad news out there, and we just heard a lot of bad news. But Christ is the good news. And if you have Christ, you have good news in your life. You have things that are going to lift you up in your life.